Hi, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I'm Dr. Justin Essery, Assistant Professor at Rice University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Mike Ward from Duke University. Welcome, Mike.
Hello.
This talk is entitled Irregular Leadership Changes, I guess it's in 2014 and beyond, forecast using ensemble, split population, duration models. Mike's talk will last between 30 and 40 minutes, after which point we will take questions from the audience. You may call in to ask a question on the air at our toll-free call-in line, 1-855-667-8287. That's 1-855-NO-STATS. Or you can email questions to us at methods.colloquium@gmail.com. Finally, you can ask a question using the GoToWebinar Ask Question box that appears on the GoToWebinar control panel. For our viewers outside the United States, we recommend using the Ask Question box to ensure that we receive your questions immediately. A copy of the slideshow that goes along with this presentation is available at the link shown on the sidebar for your GoToWebinar panel. And now I'd like to welcome Mike to the IMC.
Great, thank you, Justin, and thanks so much for inviting me to participate. I apologize to everyone. I'm fighting a spring cold, which hit me pretty hard last night, but so my voice is not what it is meant to be, and I'll be performing a lot of work with this tool here throughout my talk, so I apologize in advance for that. I'm excited to talk to you about this. This is a project that Andreas Bieger and I have been working on for a number of years, and it initially started out as an effort to help the Political Instability Task Force gain access to predictions that were below the annual level and that used information that was available at a lower level of granularity. And so what we did was we began looking at the Archegos data, and the Archegos data is a data set that was originally created by Hein Goleman, Giacomo Chiozzo, and Christian Gleditsch, and to measure the ways in which leaders throughout the history of the world came into power and how they exited power. And the initial version of this was updated through 2004, then there was a 2009 update, and then Andy and Cassie Dorf, who worked with us on an earlier phase of the project, updated the data, and then we also helped provide some of our own additional updates to Christian and Hein and Giacomo for their recent release of the data, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, and that data now goes all the way up to December 2014. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is our attempt to model these particular data. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the methods, the review, some new forecast, and some of the basic issues. ILCs is just a term that we made up to capture a wide range of irregular leadership changes, including coups or instances in which leaders were forced out of the government by forced out of leadership roles by other government agents, or by protest behavior, a variety of different ways in which the leadership could be irregular. And the basic idea is that the change, either the entrance to leadership or the exit to leadership, or both, contravene the state's established rules or conventions. This is, it sounds straightforward, but there are some ambiguities in that, and some areas in which different coders don't always agree. I'll just leave that for later. So here's an official photo in Egypt, and there was the 2011 revolution. It's kind of an interesting revolution because initially the military stayed out of it, the protests grew, and then there was an election. Morsi was elected, and then there was another coup, and the military played a slightly different role, and an election was held, and El-Sisi became president. And so these are the kinds of things that we're interested in being able to predict. And in the past, most of the work on coups and these sorts of leadership changes have all been at the annual level. So if you look, for example, at Jay Ulfelder's work on forecasting coup behavior, he's sort of interested in telling you what the probability that Burkina Faso will have a coup in the next year will be, but not when in that year it's likely to have a coup, and not anything at a more disaggregated temporal level. So these processes that we're talking about often overlap, and so what we're just going to focus on is just the leadership change itself. There are lots of different theories, I guess, or variables that people have used to try and to quote-unquote explain why these things occur. As I mentioned earlier, there's quite a large interest in this within the U.S. foreign policy community. There are about 100 irregular leadership changes since 1990, and this is a map that shows you the leadership changes since January 2001 through to the end of 2014, and you can see that there are many countries that have several leadership changes, and that a large amount of these changes are focused in Africa. What we're going to do is take the data down to the country month level, and we're going to study the period. We actually initially studied from 2001 to quarter one of 2014, but now we study from quarter one of 1991 through the last month, 2014, and we're going to exclude the United States. The initial funding for this precluded us including the United States, and there are about 164 countries that the Political Instability Task Force monitors for these kinds of things. I should mention that all of this data that we're using is available. It's all unclassified. All the research is open. And we use basically three types of data, which will be familiar to many of you. One is the Archegos leader data that I spoke about. Then there are structural variables from a variety of sources. And then we use event aggregation from the IQ's event database as well. And so these are data that are gleaned from a corpus of about 30 million news stories from 275 news sources around the world, and aggregated with an ontology that has a long legacy in international relations. I can talk more about that if there's interest. And so the standard kind of way to approach these problems would be to have some really strong theory and to deduce from that theory how you thought the data were generated, but we don't really believe that there are any really very good theories and for these processes. And so instead what we've done is we're using an ensemble approach, and we've defined 7 sort of themes, or what Andy likes to call niches, that we're going to focus on, and essentially we're going to use these niches to create models, and then we're going to average over those niches, and the model that we'll use will be a split population duration model. So we have very sparse data. Obviously, since it's a prediction project, we do out-of-sample testing, but the positive rates are like 17 events per 10,000. So as I'll come to later, that is more or less trying to, I don't know if needles in haystacks are even rarer than that, but it's in the realm of finding a needle in the haystack. And what we're going to do is use a split population duration regression model, and we've developed an R package that estimates this, and we're in the process of making that available on CRAN, but it's available if anyone wants to get in touch with us. We'll be fine sharing that with them. And what we're trying to do is take into account that some places will never experience one of these irregular leadership changes, or very, very unlikely to. And so if we throw Fiji, which has a lot of irregular leadership changes, into the mix with New Zealand, which doesn't have very many leadership changes, we're likely to get estimates that don't reflect what's really going on, and we'll get estimates that have probably too high of an estimate for New Zealand and too low of an estimate for Fiji. And so what we do is we sort of combine a regular duration type of model with an estimate of how likely it is that the country is at risk for an irregular leadership change. So we have two things. One is the probability of a risk conditional on the survival of no leadership change to time t, and then we have essentially a probability of a failure at time t plus 1 conditional upon the survival to time t, given that you're at risk. And so essentially what we do is kind of have two parts to this kind of modeling, and the one part is sort of the conditional risk, and then that is conditional upon whether or not the hazard, and that's conditional upon whether or not the case is at risk. And it turns out that when you do it like this, you get a better kind of a truer estimate of the true risk to the cases that are likely to not be immune to the risk. And so that's the basic assumption and idea that we're working with. And we incorporate these two aspects into the likelihood function so that there are two parts, one for those cases that are at risk and one for those cases that are not at risk. The split population approach has been widely employed in the medical literature, and there are many examples of it being used in the political science and social science literature, but not so much in this particular realm, and not always in the duration context. Okay, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. This goes into a greater detail on the model, and what we have in our software is a way to choose one of two types of distribution. So we can either have a Weibull distribution or a logistic distribution that are available to modelers in this package called SP Duration, which is a standard R package that at some point Brian Ripley will agree to host. Okay, and so the main quantity of interest here is the conditional hazard, H of T of pi, where both the risk and cure probabilities and the hazard are conditional upon the survival to time t. And so for any unconditional risk rate, the probability that a particular case with survival time t is in the risk set decreases over time because there's an increasing number of surviving cases that consist of either immune or cured instances that are not likely ever to fail again. And so in the hazard rate, the failure rate is in the numerator is conditional on the probability that a case is in the risk set. And this is just the math that allows us to calculate those things. These are highly nonlinear functions, and the minimization over these kinds of likelihoods is not a trivial. It turns out not to be as straightforward as maybe I portrayed it here. Okay, so what we do then is we run these split population duration models in each of these 7 themes, and then we use an averaging approach. We treat the results in the themes as ensembles, and then we average in a Bayesian way over all the ensembles to get then a weighted estimate of each of those ensembles that then produces a joint probability that takes all of them into account. And ensemble Bayesian model averaging, for which we also have a package that is available at CRAN, essentially allows us to do this. And I guess the basic point is that the basic point is that in almost all research that's been done and that I've been able to look at in different disciplines, there's one result, and that is that the ensembles almost always outperform on average any individual model, especially in out of sample and predictive tasks. In sample, there of course could be a single model that is better fitting to the data, but the ensemble approach helps make sure that you're not overfitting the data with a particular model. Okay, and so for each forecast, there's a prior probability distribution, and essentially the conditional probability is given by this approach, and then the marginal PDF is given by this equation, which just sums over the different components. And what happens when you run the EBMA is that you get a weight for each of the themes, each of the components in the ensemble that is calibrated to its ability, not in-sample ability, but its calibration out-of-sample ability to produce predictions. And we have it's not reflected in these equations, but the one we use has something in it called the wisdom of the crowds parameter that Jacob Montgomery and Florian Hollenbach and I introduced, which ensures that every component in the ensemble at least gets some of the weight in the final probability distribution. Otherwise, you often get things where some of your models, some of your themes in this context here have weights of 0. And we ensure that that won't be the case. And so for what we're doing here, let's see, this needs maybe a little bit of updating, but we look at the dependent variable, which is the irregular leadership change, and we go back to 1955 for leaders that are in power now, but maybe were in power all the way back to 1955. And so we use that to calculate the duration counters for those leaders, for the spells of leadership that is there. And then we actually start the training data in, I'll talk about 2, but what we're doing now is 1990 to 2010. And so we estimate the model in this training period, and then we use the results of that model in a calibration period, which goes from 2010 on up to the middle of 2012. And we use that to calibrate the ensemble model and get the weights then of each of the themes that we're looking at. And then, given that we've done that, we have a new prediction, which is the weighted ensemble of all the other predictions that we've made, and we evaluate that in another set of data that we've kept aside, and then we use that to make a forecast. So we have an out-of-sample period of data here that we use to kind of evaluate things, and then we actually generate real forecasts out into the future. Here, the data were not used in the modeling process or the calibration process, but they're used in the evaluation of the model, and then here the data haven't occurred yet, and so we have to wait to see how they evolve. And the ensemble gets AUC's area under a receiver operating characteristic curve of about 0.85. We did this last year. These were the predictions that we made using this approach for early last April for the next 6 months through September. And we all of these are countries that have some unusual characteristics that might lead you to think that an irregular leadership change would not be unusual or not be totally out of the realm of possibility, and we actually were able to declare victory because there was one of these, Thailand, had a coup in the forecast period. There was another one that occurred in Burkina Faso, but it was just barely outside of our forecast window, so we couldn't take credit for that. But now we've updated the approach, and so and this is the top 10 forecast that exists for the next 6 months, for January, February, March, April, May, and June of 2015. I'll come back to that a little bit later. This is what it looks like for the different themes that we have and the conditional probabilities for the case of Israel, for the case of India, and what we've done is also generated a situation where we're making a rolling forecast in the test set, so we get more chances to evaluate it. We have the data going back to 1991, and we have these niche themes. And so how accurate are these? And it turns out the recall is pretty good. The overall accuracy statistics are tremendous, but you can get tremendous accuracy by not doing all this and just saying there will not be an irregular leadership change. So just write down 0, you'll have good accuracy, but you will have lousy precision. So we use the Roc curve as kind of a way of comparing the true positive with the false positive rate, but it's sort of set up for balanced data. And so if you look at this example, you can see if we have balanced data here, the false precision rate is just 10%, right? And here, and the recall is 25% or 50%, 25 over 50 here. But if you have sparse data, those numbers, are more problematic, and it's harder to tell how well you're doing. And so, and this is really what Andy came up with. But the standard ROC curve doesn't show itself to be that sensitive, although it still tells you what it tells you. But if you actually map the precision against the recall, you get a better impression, a better sense of how well the models are doing. And so the rolling forecasts are pretty good. We have in the new period a lot more total numbers of irregular leadership changes, although the mean level seems to drop a little bit. And the new, we extended the IQ's data back to 1991. It actually goes back to 1990. And what you can see here is that there's some calibration issues for the earlier IQ's data compared to the more recent IQ's data. This data has been vetted a lot more, studied a lot more, and has greater quality control. This was kind of added to it by the larger project of which this is part, and the dictionaries aren't as well developed for the earlier period. And so we recognized that that was a problem, and we included sort of monthly indicators of the number of events. We tried both a dummy variable for these two periods and the monthly event counts, and the second one seemed to work better. We get a little bit of jumpy weights changing around. These are the 7 models, 7 niche models: leadership characteristics, public discontent, global instability, which is an attempt to incorporate the variables that the Political Instability Task Force has found to be important in prior efforts at modeling coups and the like. Then we have measures of protest, measures of instabilities and contagions in nearby regions, nearby countries, level of internal conflict, and then we have a variety of financial indicators. And so these are all of the themes or niches, and this sort of shows you that for all the themes, they do tend, these are separation plots, they tend to get a lot of the ones at the higher levels of probabilities, but there are lots of false negatives on all the themes. I'm going to skip over that. And so the themes are kind of Andy likes to call it a poor man's approach to boosting, models that capture some neglected but systematic mechanisms that might be useful but not as powerful in generalist models. And so how do we, you know, the competing approach is just you take all of the variables that you can think of and then run all the models and choose the best one. But we don't really do it that way. We sort of prune down each of the themes to variables that we think make sense, so that it's a manageable number, so that when we get a result we can kind of tear it apart and look at it and see what's driving it. So that's one of the benefits of doing that. And this is the 2014 ensemble. I want to show you that the weights in the 2014 ensemble were such that this is data from 2001 to 2014. The contagion and internal conflict themes were most important. The ensemble is most accurate of any of the themes. And if you look at the one we've just recently completed with data that goes back to 1990 to the present, you'll see that now the contagion and internal conflict models are not as powerful. Again, it's a larger period of time. And the financial model, as well as the public discontent and characteristics of the leaders, their age, etc., turn out to be more important. And so I had part of this table earlier. If you integrate over all the predicted probabilities for the next 6 months, you will have a sum that equals 1.7. So that means you should expect about 1 or 2 irregular leadership changes in that period, conditional upon the model being correct. And then these are the top, the dirty dozen countries that make up most of this, but not all of this 1.7. And it's, again, all of these are places that either have had coups in the past or seem ripe, like Nigeria, for some sort of unusual leadership change. This is a map of all the predictions over January to June in 2015, and you can see that it does concentrate still in the same kind of regions where we've seen irregular leadership change, but it also assigns fairly high probabilities to not just the Ukraine, but also South Asia and a few of the Latin American countries also get a high level of predicted probability for the hazard of an irregular leadership change. So what we've done is we've taken very complicated data that measures how long someone is in a leadership role, and we've combined that with very complicated data on events and other kinds of highly disaggregated actions that occur around the world, and use this split population model to sort of prune out the countries that are not at risk and focus in to get better estimates of the risks for this kind of irregular leadership change in the countries that are thought to be at risk. And if we get one or two right, that'll be a grand victory, and if we don't, then it won't. But the thing, I guess, to leave you with is that all of these things are predicted events that have very low probabilities. And so if you have 20 events, 20 cases where you predict the probability is 5%, you expect one of those on average to turn out to be true. And all of our predicted probabilities are really pretty low. So it's not the case that the one with the highest probability is the only one you need to monitor. You need to sort of figure out how you're doing in the aggregate statistics as well. As I said, all the data are publicly available. The EBMA package is going into a new iteration on CRAN that's much faster, and the split population, the split population duration package is available, and something that we'll be making available on CRAN in the next several months. And so there is a replication archive, and most of you probably aren't interested in irregular leadership changes, but it may be that the technology that we've sort of put together here will be interesting to a wider group of folks. With that, I'd like to thank you for listening to my scratchy voice.
Okay, thanks for that presentation, Mike. At this point, Mike is available to take questions from the audience. You can call in a question to the air on our toll-free call-in line. The number is 1-855-667-8287. That's 1-855-NO-STATS. You can email questions to methods.colloquium@gmail.com. Finally, you can ask a question using the GoToWebinar Ask Question box that appears on the GoToWebinar control panel. For our viewers outside the U.S., we recommend using the Ask Question box to ensure that we receive your question immediately. And I'll start off by asking a few questions that I had. So one thing I'm interested in here is the idea that you're trying to predict very low probability events. So, for example, everyone fills out a bracket during March Madness, right? But even for the best teams, even you're at Duke, so even Duke has usually a pretty good chance of winning. But even the very best teams have a very small chance of making it through all of the brackets. So we know something's going to happen, but it's very, very hard to tell which of the things that could happen is going to happen. And I kind of wonder about these irregular, lots of things like this, like conflicts or irregular leadership exchange turnovers, or any number of events that are low probability. To what extent are we able to to what extent can we tell the difference between a 1% chance and a 0% chance? Like, is that to what point is
Well,
there?
there's a huge difference between a 0% chance and a 1% chance.
Theoretically, yes, but empirically, how good are we at distinguishing those?
Well, I think we're pretty good at that, and you know um, sure we're surprised, and I think we get if we stay at a really high level. So we're just doing years, and we're trying to predict the probability that a country will have an irregular leadership event in a month or in a year. Um, so those probabilities are a little bit larger, and maybe we should stay there. But it doesn't, um, it doesn't provide much guidance on the policy sphere, and it actually doesn't increase the probabilities that much. I think the real thing that matters here, Justin, is that we keep track of how we're doing, and we try and do it. And so, as far as I can tell, there aren't many people making these kinds of predictions. We're getting more of them. The OSI project is predicting very rare events. That's an IARPA project that uses a variety of signals processing and other kinds of modeling approaches. They're predicting protest in Latin America on a monthly basis, and they've been able to get 80% accuracy in terms of 80% precision and recall 1 week out. So, Phil Tetlock's group also has very precise predictions of very rare events in terms of the ACES project, and the IQ's stuff has been reasonably robust in that regard as well. Those events are not quite as rare as these, but the events that Phil Tetlock is and his group of aggregate forecasters is that they're making forecasts on are really rare events as well. And so I think what people have found out is that if you keep track, you will and use the feedback wisely, you will get better at doing this. And I think that's true whether or not you're using some sort of statistical approach or some sort of other approach that you might be using, like Phil's work at the Good Judgment Project.
I was actually going to ask you about that. So, do you have any kind of compare? Oh, go ahead.
And the other thing that people have found in all of these realms is that aggregating lots of different forecasts serves you well. So, of the forecasting work that's been done in the last couple of years, I think those are the two big lessons.
I was going to ask you about comparing your technique to the technique of asking 5 country experts to assess probabilities, and then sort of entering those probabilities as sort of raw arguments into a hazard function or something. Is there been anyone actually looking at whether that? I mean, I know there are one-off projects where people put predictions in envelopes and then see whether they work out. But has anyone actually compared numerical predictions in this particular arena?
Well, we've tried. I've done some work with Phil Tetlock on their predictions, and we've tried to get something going that will compare the statistical models with the subject matter experts, and we haven't really succeeded at bringing the rubber to the road there to get a good answer. And so there are 4 I don't have access to that have tried to do this kind of thing. And the main thing I would suppose would be that you would compare this to a classified prediction model and use one of the classified prediction markets inside the intelligence community or at the State Department or wherever to see how well it does in comparison to those kinds of things. And I don't have access to those things. I don't want access to those things, and so I don't know how it does. I do know that people in the U.S. government find these kinds of models helpful for as input to the variety of their warning indicators. So we don't know. My experience is in the Good Judgment Project, the really good forecasters, the so-called expert teams of forecasters, and maybe some of our listeners or you or you, Justin, are one of these individuals, but they tend to be people that are really addicted to a high rate of information processing. We might call them news junkies. They keep track of how they're doing, and they adjust their priors really quickly when they get new information. Now, those guys are making predictions in the sense that Nate Silver made predictions. That is not in the sense that Drew Linzer made predictions.
Right.
So they adjust their predictions every day. They get to enter a new probability every day until the time period is over. That's a little bit different than what we've been doing. Although we have this rolling forecast that we're working on to try and get closer to that. But I think it's, the longer out you can make the predictions, the more impressive I think it becomes. So it's a good question. We've tried to figure out how to do it. Phil Tetlock is very interested in this kind of approach. We spent a year kind of working on projects, but it was it turns out to be a complicated issue.
So I also wanted to ask you about the idea of, I wouldn't call them rolling predictions, but you can think about data coming in at certain intervals, and for example, making predictions over the next 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, versus trying to update your probability every day or even every hour based on things that are happening. So, for example, using social media as some sort of raw data input, or the news, something like that. I wanted to ask you about, do you think that these events a year out or 2 years out are definitely rare events? Does the theoretical process work in such a way that a week out they're not rare events? Like you can see something coming a day in advance or a week in advance? Because I could see that being very useful, maybe not so much to political scientists, but definitely to the government. That would be very useful.
Well, we're trying to assess that, and my sense is that that's also very hard, even just predicting. These things are surprising when they occur even a week out. Now, if you're in the middle of a protest movement in the Ukraine, and they're burning the central square in Kiev, is it more likely that there's something terrible is going or something unusual outside of the norm is going to happen in the next week? Well, sure, but what about the week before the fire started? And so part of that I think has to do with bounding what you're looking at, and at some point if you decrease the size of the forecasting window, at some point you get everything endogenous and it's hard to pull things apart. So yeah, I think that is an issue. I don't think we have a good handle on how to use different kinds of social media for these predictive kinds of things. David Lazar is doing some work on predicting elections around the world based upon social media, and he's been having a pretty good success rate. He's part of the OSI project at IARPA. That's one of the 5 things that they're working on, predictions for elections and protests, military conflicts. I've forgotten the other 2. But suppose you had There's this new project at IARPA called Mercury. Hasn't started yet, but they've had the announcements on it, and they're going to use signals intelligence. Well, maybe there's a lot of information in signals intelligence. I don't really know. I don't know what signals intelligence from Yemen looks like, what's normal, what kinds of things that you can learn from and so getting really, really disaggregated maybe takes us away from what we're interested in.
So, I think about there being two kinds of predictions: long-run structural predictions, which is analogous to like what Alan Abramowitz or Drew Linzer, you're making a prediction about the presidential election 6 months out on the basis of fundamentals, and then you just stick with that, right? I mean, this is Alan's basic approach. You make a forecast on the election, and that's it. You don't update every day. And then there are short-run predictions where, or not really short-run predictions, but you're making predictions on the basis of data which are not evident until the short run. In other words, they're error dominated until a couple of days out. Would these rare events be less rare and more structural if you were going to extend the time horizon to something like sometime in the next 20 years Egypt is going to experience an irregular turnover?
Well, there's Howard Hegra has this forecasting project that goes out 50 years predicting conflicts. And there's a high probability that there will be a domestic conflict of some sort of civil conflict in Nigeria in the next 50 years. But what about things that move more smoothly and slowly, like population, which Howard's forecasts are largely based upon? The UN Population Office tries to predict the precise demographics in each country out 50 years. And they do it with ensemble approaches that average across different understandings of what the laws of demography are. So even, for things that you might do in the long run, I think this averaging process is a good idea. Whether if we extend the time horizon long enough, that everything has a 0.5 or higher probability of occurring, I suppose maybe that would be a different kind of endeavor. But I think we need to be somewhere closer to the real time scale that people can. That people navigate on a day-to-day basis. But if I can give you a prediction that there's going to be, an irregular leadership change in Ukraine tomorrow, that's not very helpful. It might be amusing at a dinner party or a cocktail party, but so there's some horizon that's informative about the kinds of theories that you have. I don't think we have many theories in this regard. And there's some horizon that is informative for kinds of actions that you might take to try and keep people from getting harmed or put logistics for public health in place in order to help folks out in the path of a conflict, or all the other kinds of things that governments and international organizations might do.
I think that a lot of our theories are really structural. So I'm almost more interested, from a scientific perspective, about whether we can predict frequencies in a medium term or a long term. But that wouldn't be terribly useful if I was the CIA director, because what I really need to know then is, okay, well, where should I deploy my forces? Where should I send agents? Where do I need to allocate my monitoring or whatever? Then I kind of do need to know, maybe not tomorrow, but next week or next month.
Well, let's take an example. So let's say in 1989, you had Steven Pinker's structural theory of the decline of violence. Mm-hmm. So you could say, well, I don't need to be worried about any of these other things because over the long run, everything is going to be fine. And I think when you get to that point, you sort of give up the ability to say, well, it's not going to be very pleasant in Poland for a while, and there are going to be people starving, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you give up your ability to make more conditional and more constrained statements about how those structural changes are going to occur. So we've tried to include some structural factors, but focus on things that change pretty rapidly in most of the variables that we have.
I want to ask you a very technical question. So you're basing your predictions on fundamentally on a Weibull model, right? On a split population version of a parametric duration or survival model. And I was just actually teaching the variations of these models to my one of my statistics classes this week. And one of the criticisms that comes out about those things is that they're very restrictive parametrically, right? If you get the distribution wrong, there's no guarantee that the results that come out are necessarily the ones you want or the ones that would make sense. And so I'm wondering the extent to which you're worried about the parametric structure of the model kind of informing your estimates in ways that would be bad, and how you would figure that out if it were true, and if it is true, what you could possibly do about it.
Yeah, I mean we've looked at some different ways of specifying this, but as I said, the models are pretty touchy to begin with, and there's another aspect of these split models that also is thornier that we've been a little bit more concerned about to date. And I know Andy is on, and he may want to address this as well. But essentially, the split population model assumes that there's no correlation across the two components of the model, and that's also a component of this set of assumptions that may not be perfect. So yeah, there's probably more development that can be undertaken, and hopefully some folks will begin to start working on that. But this is what we've done so far, and this is under active development with several of us, with Andy and Nils and Danny Hill and Dinah Chiba. We're all working in this regard, and so if you have some specific suggestions, that would be really great. But this is sort of where we've gotten to date.
No, I mean, of course there are semi-parametric models, but I'm not aware. I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm not aware of their application to split population or zero inflated cases. Like, is there a zero inflated Cox proportional hazard model? Yeah, I don't know. That would be the first place I would think of, but
yeah.
Of course, those models have their problems too. I mean, one thing that I'm thinking about is, so if I'm a person that's not fundamentally interested in forecasting, I'm just a political scientist, but I am interested in making sure that my models make sense. What can we learn from this forecasting exercise that's applicable to validating and checking models that are not really designed to forecast, but I want to have some, I want them to be right, or at least not terribly wrong.
Right, so what would that, I mean, if you just want to summarize the data, you already have the data.
Right.
So my take on this won't be surprising, and that is that you need to hold some data back, and you need to do this in a way that you can use that data to make sure that your model and the data aren't sufficiently convolved with one another that you can't pull them apart. And so what having forecasting or out of sample kinds of data that you evaluate that model against gives you the ability to say, no, it's really, there's something fundamental here that's going on. And forecasting is just, in my opinion, an extreme version of doing this kind of undertaking. And you'll see, you know, we do both the cross, in some sense it's not a cross-validation, but it is a calibration with unique data that weren't used to estimate the models themselves. And then we take that with more data. So these are data-needy kinds of things, but the idea that you would have a brilliant model that was really, really accurate that would be terrible at forecasting, you know, I have, you know, I don't know what that means.
I actually want to, so Chris Zorn apparently says there is a Cox proportional hazard model that allows for split population or some sort of zero inflation. So he did not elaborate, but apparently it's possible. Okay, go ahead.
We'll look into it. Thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, well, we're right at noon, so I want to thank Mike for a great talk today. Thanks very much for being here. This is our last scheduled talk for the spring 2015, but we'll be back in the fall with a new slate of presentations. If you'd like to sign up to be a presenter, please go to our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, for more details. Also, we're really interested in doing other kinds of presentations, not just the sort of, you know, slides and talk with a research project. If you have ideas for roundtables or workshops or other things that you think we can host that would attract attention, we're really interested in doing that. So feel free to get in touch with me via our website to propose those talks as well. Mike, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you.
All right, I will see you everyone next semester.